Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Emperor card. I was able to get about halfway through, unfortunately, but very interesting discussion on power and authority. Yeah, I think he just really jumps right into it, right? Description of what the card looks like, the different elements of his stance and what he's holding. And talking about authority. Yeah, very relevant. What were all of our like overall impressions of this chapter? You know, how far did you get? How did you feel about the reading? Like, I felt it was a little easier to read than the other chapters so far. At least like it flowed for me a little bit easier than the other ones have. But yeah, what do you all think? Just big picture.
I'm feeling moved by this book more than like any other book we've read, or I've read almost. It's kind of crazy. It's like changing the way I think about things in really fundamental ways. It's really powerful and very difficult. And like, I'm not even sure. I don't even know if I'm getting it right when I'm interpreting it. I'm having a relationship with the words. But I don't know if it's right, if that's like what he intended, but it's really interesting. It somehow like has a spiritual conversation with me or something, like where it's not like a dogma, but it's a conversation, It's like the best kind of book. But this chapter really got that. What's that?
I think the relationship is the intended, right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
That's been my impression. So but I wanted to ask Haley, do you think that the material has been easier, or do you think that you're starting to like tune to it better?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that as it goes on. I feel some of the topics are things that I've been thinking of recently. So maybe I'm being tuned to it, like you're saying.
Yeah, because I mean, it's just like, even just like the linguistic like sort of patterning of it is like, it's not something that I don't think you encounter very often. So I wonder if like there's a part of it that's just like, I'm kind of getting used to what's going on here. But yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, good question.
It might also be true that at this point, because we're at the fourth card, there's kind of a framework that's been built already, and he's just adding to it. So it's not like we're just like diving off the deep end into the unknown. You kind of have like a feel for what's going on by now. So it might just be easier to like put all the pieces together.
I also think this is a very earth realm heavy sort of subject, which is much easier for folks like us to relate to, in terms of we're very much here in a cycle where we're into the physical, right? Everything material. So it's a little bit easier to relate to the realms of the material where powers manifest, right? Even though it still loops into conversation of the previous three chapters, it's less abstract, it's less pure potential, more like, hey, here's the structure that's in place. But because of that, I also thought this was the chapter that I had the most difficult time, I wouldn't say relating to, but I have a difficult time gelling with him on his assessment of authority.
Yeah,
same.
Protesting a lot, being like,
yeah. It's a little, it feels, I didn't protest it, but I did not fully agree with it either, right? It's that sense of, I want to see what he has to say about it before I just protest it. And obviously this is a framework that's been in place for a while. So, we have when the criticisms do come, they have a much more solid basis in our everyday experience, because, that's pretty much this sort of hierarchical structural is the age that we're coming from, and that most of us have lived most of our lives in it. So
Absolutely,
it's easier to relate to.
And most of us actually have been I think I would say in some ways indoctrinated in this anti-hierarchical. Most of us here, I think, and that's I think he makes somewhat of a point that like, what are we believing in? And that's what this gets me. That's why, like, I understand like not gelling with this whole authoritarian like hierarchical thing, but it's also like a really interesting examination of like, if we're not in that, what are we worshiping? And I think that's the real like spiritual meat of this chapter. It's not that it's not that like it's like it's giving us a conversation about what is authority, like what authority do you actually ascribe to, because everybody ascribes to some authority in some sense, like and in so doing he actually describes freedom in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I think the term freedom, right, being a central concept earlier in the chapter, is really all about kind of leading the horse to the to drinking the water, in terms of framing it, where one thing is, its polar opposite lies in its power, right? Which is a device that Christianity very definitely use a lot, in terms of framing everything in the opposite. And he roped in some Taoism there to try to demonstrate authority, right? Which is funny.
Yeah.
But I had a nice chuckle, but it's but the chuckling aside, it's not an unfair read into into what he's trying to make. It's just not in the spirit, right? It's very Western in the way that he used it, which is to take it out of the context.
The Taoist would have nothing to do with the divinity that is creating the void in the first place. The void is just the void. It's nothing. There's no divinity outside of it in that sense.
Yeah, so it's which is why I chuckled, right? And also why I had a little internal like dialogue. It's like, oh, this, he pulled, this is a nice way of framing it, I guess. But anything can be framed in any way, especially outside of the context. So if you, this is the problem with pulling text from the Bible, like specific verses, and then claiming that supports your point, right? Because it can support any point, out of context. Even in the context, it can support any point when you go ahead and set the framework where the opposite is the thing that will lead you to the complete polar opposite conclusion. So it can be anything, which is to say it says nothing. There is nothing useful that is being said aside from a postulation.
But I think that's the point, right? Like to make the postulation is the point, right? Like whether you agree or not, or like whether you create your own postulation or I have my own or whatever, it's like to construct the story out of the material, isn't that part of the point too? Like to say that it says nothing, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree.
Yeah, that's not a fair characterization. It would violate one of the 4 areas that he points out, right? Which is the objective evaluation, right? If we're talking subjectively, I create a system. I forward this system, right? I posit this system. I explain it in the logical structure as a demonstration that I can do so and that I can communicate it. But if you and I disagree on it, right, it fails the objective evaluation criteria. So he's not asking you to agree with him. That he's trying to get out of that trap philosophically or logically, right? He's saying that if it passes muster with me, but then how could that possibly be objective? Like what does objectivity in that case mean, right? Individual evaluating based on external rules. And if one person is satisfied, one person, does that qualify as objectivity? So that part of it is really gray, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I mean,
yeah,
I think that would be maybe my first kind of major disagreement, which is like, yeah, I mean, there's an issue when you kind of like come into, what is objective, and can we even constitutes something that actually looks objective, and by which standards do we then do that, right? Because I tend to think that things are much more relational, which has to do with the subjective component rather than the objective component, right? You take two things we could define as objective, but you change them not by changing them, but by changing the subjective interaction between the two things, right? And so, yeah, I just the concept of objectivity in and of itself for me, just from like a epistemological lens, has always been a very ephemeral thing, in my view.
Yeah, it's an interesting continuous discussion in philosophy for a very long time, in terms of the objective reality, or are you just projecting everything out of your eyeballs, right? You're projecting a external reality that's entirely of your own making, and you can't really know. Right? That's the sort of philosophical disagreement that has been around forever.
Well, I think the thing is that it's both. I mean, you observe things, sure, but you also have to create inner objects of those things, which are composed of the sensory data, but also your internal notions of those things.
You could argue that your internal notion is unknowable to you. You project it, and then your conscious discover it too. Just once again, this is we're using the Western, like, you know, we can make black whites at any point by simply pointing out the one inconsistency, which is, you know, which we can always do in any system that we can even talk about, because of the incompleteness principle. So it, you know, it's so really it comes down to, you know, like our own personal evaluation. But then at that point, right, it's like, is that the point of the conversation? Because he certainly is positing a lot of stuff. He's, you know, in one hand, we can say that he is demonstrating by example a internal dialogue that can be very useful, right?
Yeah.
Just based on meditation on a set of cards, which I'm not even sure, like as I'm reading, right, as I'm reading his description, I'm thinking to myself, that's really cool that you're coming up with all these associations, and then these are things that are meaningful to you. It certainly relates to your own internal framework that you have verified, and you have come to accept based on your internal discrimination criteria. But well, it's I had a point there. Took too long to try to explain it, but there's like the cards themselves might not ever have intended those things. Somebody could have just been drawing these cards with something else in mind. It could have very easily tell an entirely different story by using the same set of cards.
Well, the cards he's using the Marseille deck, because this is not the Rider deck, it's the Marseille.
It's the Marseille deck.
On the Rider deck.
Yeah.
The Rider, whatever.
Right. It is it's closest to the original Italian decks, right? The Marseille are the copies and the expansion of the Italian decks that they were playing cards. But I have a set here. It's very nice. I highly recommend you guys picking it up if we're doing this book.
I love mine.
Yeah, it's a beautiful. Yeah, it's a very nice set of cards, because in some ways, right, we're so conditioned to the training set, the Rider-Waite training set, that sometimes we don't no longer look at them. Really, we just like immediately get triggered by like our internal representation or associations, right, when we look at them, or they immediately take us to a state where we're starting to pick up information. So I do appreciate once in a while switching it up. And and there's really not that many real options, because most of the decks out there are based on Rider-Waite in one way or another, and this one is not.
Cody, did you have some?
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna make like a. I don't even quite remember what I feel like he's making something of an argument for that subjectivity. I mean, what I was going to say was he's making an argument for a way of seeing the world that is like that's filled with divinity and filled with freedom, actually. And I think that's what comes really interesting. Yeah, of course, he's just like picking these things from his own background, his own readings. He's picking these things somewhat like to fit his narrative, but I think he does so very, very purposefully to create this world, this certain logic of his findings. And I think it's a really beautiful logic, but it's also like, I think within it is like a kind of a self-awareness that he's doing that. I mean, that's the sense that I get. Like, he understands this problem, and that's part of the problem of, like, he gets into like what is, what fact is versus what, and the next card too, especially too, what fact is versus like objective fact and kind of subjective fact or moral fact. And the next chapter gets heavily into this because it's the Pope. It's like moral. So he's making this like really interesting, like full picture of like just ways our minds, like a map of the mind that I think is really interesting, that I've never really encountered quite like this. And it's very Christian. And it's actually like, it's really interesting because I had mentioned that podcast I was listening to, but it's talking like, I just listened to these episodes about the late pagan Neoplatonists, like the early Neoplatonists that, and they made an argument for, and he's just echoing them like heavily. Like, it's the whole idea of like this one divine thing, or there's like the divinity, but then there's the monad that creates and he even uses the word monad, that creates the creation, that creates the void inside, that like lets freedom happen and creation happen. But this is like all like Iamblichus and Proclus, these philosophers in like 4th and 5th centuries in Rome, and like occupied Rome, or Roman occupied territories. But it's not, a lot of it's nothing new. These guys were making an argument for theurgy, like specifically Iamblichus first, and then Proclus took up his mantle. But like theurgy, like using the rituals of the ancient Greek and Roman pantheons to purify the soul, but in a Platonic sense of like purify the soul, and all the deities represent like elements from this creation all the way up into like the oneness or God, so it's like this continuum of forms. And in Iamblichus, it's like they all have mathematical correspondences, so it's all like very like, and it's all in like the Western esoteric tradition, is like carries on what these guys were talking about. But anyway, so it's like it's in that lineage, like heavily. And I find that just really cool, like seeing the history of his thought and seeing like being able to make some sense of. And Iamblichus even talks about Hermes Trismegistus. He quotes her, like Hermes is actually found in Iamblichus and Proclus.
Yeah, I mean, big picture as well. I think you're right. Like, I find his tone off-putting just because of who I am and learning how to read, him being like, this is the way and this is what it says and this is why this is wrong. Like, that just isn't how I speak, but I do think it's necessary when you need to construct such an objective opinion about something. Like, you have to have those strong words to really drive that through. And it does make a point, and this point is very clear. And he goes through all the necessary ways to get there, which I really appreciate. And it is really challenging and inspiring.
Yeah, when he starts talking about how like our lack of an emperor left like an emptiness and a wound, I like wrote "Okay, boomer" in the margin. He's like, Europe aches with the lack of emperor. I'm like, whatever, bro.
It's that Neoplatonic, like
I get his point, but on a literal sense, it's like, yeah, well, beyond that now.
It's just, it's such constructive like the structure, which is so very, very Western, right?
Yeah.
This depends on that. This depends on this. This depends on this. We have this in the East as well, but it is not. It's not hierarchical. It's more relational in the East. So there's like a web, as opposed to, if this piece is missing, the whole thing is going to fall apart, right? Because the Neoplatonic and the Platonic ideas of these ideals being the, and there, you know, from this comes this. You can see this even in the Tree of Life, right? Without this piece right here, it will not flow through this pattern, because there is nothing to cause that flow or to polarize against, right? There's no pole that can be formed, because, you know, without this, there is none of the other stuff that follows. So it's very interesting. You know, the interesting thing is this book is actually the most successful of all encounters I have had with Christianity, and really make me feel that sense of acceptance of Christianity at some level, right? Because it's never been successful in terms of my encounters with it. But this book, in its you know, very interesting way, is really getting me to open up to that mindset. And I feel like it's, you know, it's a very natural thing too. Cody, I see that you're like nodding your head in agreement, and it feels like a very natural integration of some of the underpinnings of Christianity, and it's pointing out a version of Christianity that we are not used to seeing out in the real world, but it really is part of that tradition, and really does serve as the underpinning of much, even for the people that have really taken it out of context. You can still see that underpinning there, and it's explained in a very, very structural, beautiful way. And for me, that's surprising.
And he directly criticizes other interpretations of Christianity, the Christianity of the vengeful God.
Yeah.
Like in particular, like
Almighty.
very early in the chapter. What's that?
Yeah, he does.
Almighty God too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like people that worship God because they want to partake of his power.
Right.
That was a pretty interesting criticism.
Yeah.
I think he does a better job of making Christianity make sense than
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, and even his definition of God to me feels like nature. It feels like the Tao. It feels like natural law. Just like, to me, that's what I'm getting. That's my like download, because
I think he, okay, yeah, so it is said that, so on page 79, middle, it said that nature is the horror of emptiness. The spiritual counter truth here is the spirit has a horror of fullness.
Yeah.
So he does do a couple like times of like differentiating them. I think he thinks, yeah, nature's more like the void and empty and always there, and like spirit and like God and divine is like full and love within that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm like. That's how I'm.
He draws a contrast, but I get what Cody is at least I'm interpreting what you're saying, Cody, is that there is almost like a hidden logic to the way that God operates, right? If we can understand and properly comprehend the structure leading back up to God, then it does, in a sense, feel very much like the natural laws, right? May not be nature itself in the physical, but they're the principles at work that, you know, that eventually leads to the formation of nature, and the opposition of nature to spirit, but they're mirror images of one another, and you can kind of like work your way all the way back up the chain. So it's
like through nature that we it's only through nature and through existence, and that's the point he's making. Existence is the place where we can even have an idea of contacting God at all. Like, otherwise we'd just be an undifferentiated mass, which is like the oneness, or the void, or the nothingness that is one. Whatever it is, the Ein Sof, like whatever the highest principle is.
Yeah,
the
unmanifest. The pre-manifest. Yeah, the pre-manifest.
But then, his idea is the pre-manifest and then the monad, which is the monad is what actually manifests, what actually creates. But that's fine points of theology there. But
he goes into that in pretty good detail.
Yeah.
Right. the
yeah.
Sitsum, right? For the Kabbalic school of God created a space within himself in order that we have freedom and existence. And like that is nature, like is that space, you know, I mean, I think nature also presupposes the space in my definition, like is more so in line with the definition of the void, but God himself in this, you know, in his definition created that space so that we could exist there.
Yeah,
So we
without,
can, yeah.
that was pretty interesting. Like
Yeah.
the whole some notion is the most interesting part of this chapter.
Same.
The idea that like in order to create freedom, he had to remove himself from a place so that he didn't control everything. And I was
And
like,
the idea that the crucified God too, the God that
The
suffers with
the
the power.
powerless God.
Yeah. And he says like where we embrace existence, we have God. Where we deny it or something, like that's evil, you know, something along those lines, which is interesting. Or where I was looking for the quote.
Love existence, you have chosen heaven, hate it, and there you have chosen hell.
There you go. Yeah,
Page
exactly.
83, I started.
Existence.
That was
Yeah.
going to be my conclusion quote.
Oh,
Kidding.
sorry, Haley, but it's pertinent
It's such a good one.
to to the nature point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to kind of go along with what you're talking about, this like nature or natural law or something like that, you know, a thing that I frequently think about is like when you talk about something like unconditional love, like I can think of no other thing but nature, in the sense that you can literally do anything and nature accepts you to do that. And I thought that this goes along again with what he's talking about, the difference between like the king and the crucified, and also kind of how he makes an argument for why there is like suffering and why there is like shit in the world. And it's because like this thing, there's a difference between authority and power. And so while this thing may be the ultimate, whether we call it God or nature, may be the ultimate, it only has power in that we also embrace it and allow it to flow through us. And I mean, I personally thought that was like a pretty interesting and like cogent way of describing why that is, but I would wonder what your guys' thoughts on that are.
So wait, you said the difference between authority and power is why suffer, like, and the space that's created for us to have the freedom is why there could be suffering. Is that what you?
It's that something is not power, like authority, like something being true does not necessarily mean that something is powerful, right? And by powerful, he means specifically like the thing that dominates freedom, right? I think that was my interpretation. And so, and this is kind of like what we assume now, which I kind of agree with, which is that a lot of people assume that what's true is what's powerful. And he's making an argument that like the reason why, and at least that's my interpretation, the reason why like all of these things can happen is because we do have this this choice to embrace or reject this thing. And so its authority, or rather not its authority, because its authority exists, but its power and influence in the world only really exists insofar as we allow it to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's when I was reading this, I was thinking of just all the times I've heard in my life and asked myself, you know, why would God allow suffering in this world? Like that's a question, that's main reason, you know, I would say that people do not like conventional Christianity, right? Or the conventional God is that God allows for suffering and horrors of the world to exist. But I think he really concisely answers this question, like by saying, like, what about man, and what about our role in this story, like by going into how he describes freedom and how God created that space for us to like exist in nature, that we have, freedom there to make those choices, to have this type of suffering and this type of existence, that it's not necessarily within God's will, but it's within our will. So when I was reading this and thinking of a conversation with someone, it was like, do you believe in will, or what do you think your will is like? And then do you believe in freedom? And then going off that conversation there, because I think once you ask those questions to someone, I mean, if you were, along this line fully, like, then it would really start those wheels turning. Like, okay, yeah, the will, your human will versus God's will. That's kind of the thing here, right?
Which is also a question of like, but is the human will also God's will?
Well, he specifically states that there's one quote where he says, the withdrawal of God in order to make space for freedom and his renunciation for the use of his power against the abuse of freedom. So it's like, by creating by our existence comes with freedom built into it. Like he says, if you exist, you are free. There is no dividing the two. So it's like the process of creating this void for the world to exist had freedom built into it, but in order for that to work, he had to like remove his power from the equation. So like, it's not that God allows fucked up things to happen. It's that God has removed his ability to stop anything from happening. Because if he had any power in this realm, we wouldn't have freedom. So it was one or the other. So it's not even like God doesn't have the power to allow or not allow anything. It's up to us. And all
exactly.
At least that's what it seems like. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That's really precise.
Like brings up an interesting points of discussion, right? So, okay, so along with this worldview that he is presenting, there is almost a inherent and unsaid assumption that if you only engaged in the kind of practices that lead to, you engage in meditation and then you do your practices and you will come to the same conclusion. So the natural question here is, if somebody came to the different conclusion doing the exact same set of practice, right? We're once again talking about objectivity again, because this is the fundamental disagreement between the Abrahamic religions, which is, yeah, well, you say that, but this is my tradition and it says this. And we are just as rich a tradition as yours. And we have come to a different conclusion, right? So once again, it's the assumption almost as if here is that if you are rational, if you are dedicated, if you are self-committing to discovery, then you'll reach the same conclusion. You reach a very similar conclusion, and these things will be self-evident, right? So I being, playing the devil's advocate here, but according to him, this would not be the devil's advocate, but just using the term, the kind of the term of speech here. That is an interesting point, I think, underneath that, what he is saying here. It's almost as if, by the sheer strength of the argument, he's presenting a worldview that really can only have one real conclusion. And I completely disagree with that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I guess I never would have approached it that way. It's interesting to hear you describe how you're actually approaching, because like for me, I'm looking at another storyteller, honestly. I'm looking at another person doing world building.
Yeah.
And that's my lens from which to operate. I don't know, it's just maybe different temperament or disposition between you and I.
Yeah, I do as well, right? But then I also view it, I'll put on another set of glasses, and this one would be, what is he selling? And I'll put on another set of glasses, is what is the assumption here? And can I come to different conclusions if I suspended these assumptions partially or completely, right? Or completely counter assumptions. And And here comes the the question that always arises, which is, what if you come to a different conclusion, right? It's completely allowed in the world where God has withdrawn himself, in which free will can be fully exercised. But if the point is to return to the will of God, then why begin this exercise at all? What is it that, and what if we return to different places? You can say, well, we are just multiple facets of understanding of the overall Godhood, right? Whatever that is. But what if there's a countercurrent to that, right? That is the complete dissolution of the thing that it came from, because I don't really care, which is the materialist's point of view, right? We will construct our own paradise here in the universe. We will literally, through our personal progress, become gods, right? That's what we try to do.
It feels like that's almost the whole point of us being here, is to be. So when Christianity is like, the whole point of being here is to return back where we came from, then yeah, like you said, what's the point of us being here at all?
Yeah,
Like,
which is my internal discomfort with this sort of argument, right? Because what if I am more along the line of co-partnership, in which I submit my will, but God also submits some of his will, right? He is a higher order being, of course, but for him to grow, I should not always agree, right? I should choose to agree and enhance the thing, right? Or else, what is the whole point in engendering the sons of God, right? Which is supposedly a growth process for God, or for us to enhance it in some way, right? Like, so if the argument goes that way, then there is this fundamental problem, and it is a serious one in terms of this point of view. Once again, I think it hints at the incompleteness way of his argument, right? Like, yeah, that kind of makes sense, but I can very easily construct something that would be just as valid, but completely incompatible with this one.
It's gonna come to that point later on, and we just haven't got to it. But I also wasn't able to find anywhere, at least I don't remember seeing the reason why this whole project was started. Could you say what that is?
Earlier, right, there was some discussion about the sort of sons of God, when he's talking about sons of God, because it's not just us, right? Because there are other orders of
Yeah, he talks
beings.
about the 10 hierarchies of
Yeah.
God, and how we're all considered free, which I thought, according to the Bible, that the angels don't have free will, and that's part of the whole deal.
But I'm pretty sure we are the ones that kind of came to that conclusion and included it in the book. How can we possibly, it's that how can we possibly understand what the order here is, right? Like,
he made, at one point he says, like, he's talking about pantheism and how pantheism does not admit to the real existence of individual beings, and I was like, doesn't sound I think
Sorry.
we disagree with that.
That's what I mean. Like, don't talk about what you don't know about. Like,
so I didn't quite read it like that, Leo.
He's coming from like, there is only one God and there is one unity and everything is one, so there can't be pantheism, because there is
yeah. So I think pantheism, what he means by that, and in this too, is a really funny thing, right? He's using these terms in a technical way, but this technicality only makes sense for folks who think like him. So pantheism in this case, I think what he is intending to say is beings with only one will. So all the assemblage of everybody makes the whole, and he's actually actively making an argument against that. Is that it's the creation process creates something that is greater than the whole, like something different from the whole and greater than the whole. There's more after the creation process, which means pantheism cannot possibly exist. If you use his technical term logic, it means that this thing that we are living in is not it's not a part of God. It is literally a thing free and independent from him. And in that way, right, this thing, because it's not of him, we cannot possibly be pantheistic. Like, it does not belong in as a part. Like, it's a thing that grew out of it, but it is nothing of it.
well, That's so interesting because that's not how I read it. I'm more like, I mean, and this may, I mean, I don't want to be super gendered here, but I more viewed it as like a birthing process, or like a part of like how like the void is like a womb space, So I didn't see it as separate, and I didn't see but I mean, that makes a lot of sense how you're saying it, but I read it differently.
The note
Well,
I
even
made
going,
about the symptom thing was that I wrote parent and child, where he says like with the whole withdrawal to create freedom thing is like what a parent does when they have a child that they want, for a child to be healthy and develop into its own individual free thing. The parent at one point needs to like withdraw. And this
Give them space.
like making all your decisions and telling you how to live your life and all the things that parents kind of reflexively want to do keeps them from being successful parents. So it's a little bit of that seems to be happening.
And yet the parents' influence lasts a lifetime.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's just like supposedly God's influence lasts throughout this reality because it still exists inside of them, according to this.
Yeah.
Like the influence is there whether you want it to be or not, but the like direct guiding will part seems to be like different.
The whole pantheism thing was, I think, for me, when I read it, was an argument against evil, projection of evil onto God. So if that is part of God, then the whole house of cards comes down, right? Because that's the problem people have with Christianity, is how can you allow this to happen, right? So if pantheism is true, which means all of this is a component of God, necessary component of God, because without us, then he would be less, right? So
pantheism just means multiple gods.
no, it means everything is a part of God.
Everything.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, again, I don't see that as contrary, like to coming from a void space of God, like, or God pulling from the void, because I feel like that's like, again, I just viewed it more like a birthing, like, and I thought pantheism more just had like, it just, I don't even know enough to talk about it, but I felt like it was more in line with what he was saying than not. But it's just a different way of talking about like reality, which I don't know.
I think we're going to get some new insight in the next chapter too, because there's this idea of respiration that he brings up, which is really interesting. Yeah, which is like, and I think it touches on this a little bit. I think he says something like every new act of creation is preceded by a void, of an act of contraction.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So there's this interesting like cyclical thing in it. And it's like, I think we're even thinking of it in terms of time, when it's like, but it's always happening all at once kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of an idea that I'm getting from it as well. Like there's like it's, and again, it's back to the as above, so below. It's like, it's always there. So the presence of God is always there and always not. God is all powerful, but also not. But there's a freedom in like ourselves and choosing which one and how we construct that relationship between presence and not presence.
That's really beautiful.
Between the objective and the subjective realities.
Like, and that's the fun part, constructing our own little realities out of like what is and what is not. Because I agree with you, George, like there's a lot of that both ways. And I think Cody's talked about that well, like about just how like this doesn't necessarily not align. It's just very precise, which is interesting.
Yeah.
The Ein Sof Jewish mysticism quote that he put in there made me think of like the Big Bang, like the whole idea of like what was before the Big Bang. And it's like he talks about how like there's a contraction or condensation could be seen as like he condenses himself to make space for something else, and then from that condensed state explodes out into new creation, which is kind of describing like the cycle of Big Bang, Big Crunch that happens supposedly, to the best of our knowledge, in the universe. I thought that was kind of interesting. Because they don't really hear about that usually in Christianity. They don't want to talk about it at all. They're like, God has always been and will always be and is always the same. And this is actually very much not that. I mean, it is, but it's not.
Yeah, and it's taking like it's taking some of the deeper Christian and Jewish philosophies of God that are Platonic or even like Pythagorean or like more ancient than that. You know, these ideas that have actually been passed down about divinity for a really long time. He's not really saying a lot new. He's synthesizing a lot.
Yeah.
And in the next chapter, he gets heavily into Buddhism too. So I'm sorry, I keep giving you
Oh, spoilers.
All right.
but it's but I can't after reading a little bit of the next chapter, I can't take this one without that context still, you know. But
I think that might be part of it, is that we're missing the parts that we're having trouble with. We're just missing the context or the continuation of it.
and I think you're having valid trouble with these things, and I think it's really good to have those ideas.
Well, what? The Hermeticist is therefore a person who is at one and the same time a mystic, a Gnostic, a magician, and a realist-idealist philosopher. So we're just expressing our realist-idealist philosopher versions of ourselves.
Yeah.
So once again, if you're doing all of those things, right? I mean, what are you not? Like, why do you even assign a word to that? Like, it just sounds like you're everything, right? This is the term that the person who does everything is a Hermeticist. You kind of don't have a.
You're not just doing everything. Each of those things grows out of the thing before it. So it's like you have to go through these stages of development to reach the synthesis. You can't just be like, I'm all of it. Like, you actually need to like process through.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or like realizing that you're all of it as you go on, like you gain more pieces of the puzzle. Like, okay, you were always all of it, but now you're uncovering why, or the different parts of that. Maybe.
I think it's analogous to the Buddhist idea that there's always awareness is always there. It's just whether or not we recognize that awareness. You know?
Yeah, fully agree.
So one of the really cool things that this book does, like I think just by, and you pick up so much of these assumptions by osmosis, right, as you're reading through his arguments, which is the arc of Hermetic philosophy practice transmission for probably the last 2,500, 3,000 years. Like I feel like this is probably the best Hermetic education you can get by going through this book. Even though it has a bent to it, of course, right? This is Christian Hermeticism, but it is still very much Hermeticism. It's, it's got that very, very prominent mystical component to it. And it is, obviously this would be heretical and another, heretical text. Any other probably previous, 300 years ago, this would be very much heretical. But
and yet there were heretics back then.
Oh yeah, I mean they were passing it on in secret, right?
Yeah, of course, the Hermetic tradition.
But I think this book, I mean, as a magician, this really does teach you to see the world in a way that's more comprehensible in terms of when you're reading grimoires or like just books from the past. So you can you kind of grok more of what the heck they were thinking. Like when they set those rituals down or those practices down, this really does put that framework around practices and ways of transmission.
Should we discuss like authority and power and what we think? I mean, this is just I know we've touched on what he said, but maybe we should hear like if we agree with his definitions of authority and power and how that like aligns in, because I mean magic is a lot about different forms of like power, so or just this type of energy. So yeah, that's a good next topic, right? Like authority versus power. Is his versions of this in line with what you thought, or did it change your perceptions of anything? I don't know.
He uses those terms in a very specific way. So even if I had a different definition of those terms, according to the technical reading of this, it's less, right? Because I wouldn't use those words in that way. So
Right.
he draws a distinction between power and authority very clearly, right?
Yeah,
When those two. Yeah, sorry, Leo. Go ahead. Go ahead, Leo.
Sorry, I was interrupting with it. I was just saying that I think I agree with the point he makes that just because someone has power does not make them true. What they believe is say or do true. I thought that part was pretty spot on.
Hmm.
Because a lot of people will try and tell you that, where it's like, I have the power to ram you down your throat, so therefore that makes, like, religion does that all the time, where they say that because I have this sword and I can stab you with it, that makes my book true, and you have to believe me. It's like,
Yeah, you have to remind them, yeah, you can do that, but I certainly then would not believe in your God. At which point they'll tell you that doesn't matter because you're dead. And I have one less person to, right?
it's
It's the
hilarious.
same old circuitous argument around that. Because you're preaching compassion and you're enabling, you're enacting death, right?
But that death shouldn't matter to the Hermetic philosopher. Doesn't, because it doesn't really exist. It's all comes back.
Because
But-
freedom makes us immortal.
Yeah, immortal. That's part of it, and that's part of, like, I think it's the argument is similar to like the power of love, I guess, in that, like, the evil doesn't really have any power over us if like we're free, like the power of that person who would kill us for being heretical to their belief doesn't matter. Like, we're not afraid of that because, like, we're undying, because we're immortal, and so it gives them no power whatsoever. And that's like the authority is that it's like they think they have power, but it's like their power is only limited to like this world, and that's their reality. And like George was even saying, like, the materialist reality, if that's that's the reality that people are in, but it doesn't, but that doesn't concern the sage, at all. That powers doesn't have any meaning whatsoever to that, to the one who doesn't give it power.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I like how he talked about those who, like, falsely worship different types of power. Like, I thought that was really interesting, and just the idol of power, like, and seeing it as that.
And he used the church as an example of idol worshiper, which is great. I found that to be hilarious.
Yeah.
I had a good chuckle with that.
Right.
But my question for all of you is, what idols do you worship? What powers do you believe in? I think that's the question.
It depends on the operation.
Yeah.
Like, I view it more as energy streams. So, I mean, I don't know, but it's like how, like, I don't see it as like rising above others, or like, my definition of power is like, what energy stream am I flowing from, and what's being able to flow through me, and at what intensity, duration, frequency can I, like, maintain and sustain that flow. But that includes for me, like, channels of like love or compassion or listening, holding space, but also like being stern and like understanding. But that's just so much of my practice, is using the elements and then getting into different other forms of powers, and that's what I'm excited to like learn about. So, I mean, that's very different than how he would describe it here, that, I mean, I think that that's divine, but I mean, there's like so many variations of, earth elemental power, of water elemental power. Like, you can use that any way you want. It's just like knowing how to regulate and flow that like energy stream, like, that's where I think my true power lies. And I think everybody's kind of in some way or another. It's just channeling that in different frequencies depending on the individual.
Yeah,
I think he would make the argument that exactly what you're doing, like, I would think he would make the argument that the best way to come by that like flow with the elemental forces is to kind of surrender to the divine power or the divine authority, because that, again, it's like the divine authority of nature, like I said, like just the natural flow, and then you're in the flow of the elements, you're in the flow of the creation, in a sense. I mean, that's the argument I would make from his stuff, but I might be getting it wrong there somewhat.
No, I
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
like the same argument that all the like non-left hand, like, oh, we walk a higher path. It's hilarious, actually.
Right,
yeah.
but that, I don't mean like you're not walking a higher path at all, but that's the thing, is you have to humble yourself too. That's
Yeah.
so
Sure.
saying you're walking a higher
Yeah,
path is
I have no power at all, right? Basically is what you're saying, without the partnership,
Well,
which
then-
is, you can call that codependency. Like, I can wrap any word around that. Like, I just need to put a different word to it. All of a sudden I have power over that entire discussion. So it's kind of like, it's almost childish to be talking about power in that way, because it implies a fixed definition of power. And this is why when I read his definition, well, I'm not really going to argue with that. Like, in your logically perfectly formed world, this makes sense, right? Because you're defining these things, you're giving them fixed definitions. And okay, sure. But in the real world out here, the definition of power changes from moment to moment. It's not the same thing in any situation, right? So there are, I mean, for me, when you're worried about power all the time, right? You're not allowing power to flow, then that is when the problem begins to you're accumulating power, like you're accumulating money in the bank account, numbers that are compounding and growing larger in bits and bytes, right? It's exactly the same. So for me, this, intuitively, I very much disagree with the kind of way that he's talking about power and the way that it flows, because it implies a very static structure from which everything is being framed. And there's definitely some disagreement between me and the way that he's reasoning. But then again, part of really reading stuff like this is really, well, what if, right, I structure everything exactly as the way that he is doing it? Can I come to some different conclusions? Or maybe it's useful to me in some way, right? So while I'll criticize it, I'll also say that it makes a lot of sense in the way that he's framing it, right?
I mean, it makes sense abstractly, but then if you try and bring it into the real world, you encounter the same problem you encounter with everything.
Yeah.
Nature gets in the way.
Yeah.
So when he's like, the absolute power, what did he say? He is king in regard to those of his beings who voluntarily accept and believe his authority. He is crucified in respect to those who abuse his freedom and worship idols, replacing divine authority with a substitute. Slightly paraphrasing. But it's like, basically he's saying, like, either you fully submit and believe in the power of God, or you have individual thoughts of your own and you end up, worshiping idols or whatever. But like, by believing that power of God, where is that? Who is that authority that you're supposed to believe? Like, anyone that says, I am the emperor, my voice is the voice of God who speaks through me, like, I immediately am going to be suspicious of that person and not believe that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I see.
Through the history of humanity, that's the douchebag that fucks everything up for everybody else.
Well, that's what I've I've
I'm like,
seen a few friends fall into that, where it's
So-
like, what guided meditations, what energy stream are you gaining this power from? And when they can't say, or when it's some, channeled extraterrestrial that like they don't really know,
yeah,
I'm
and
like, okay, well, find the roots there. If you can't have a relationship with that thing, like, that's not something you should, like, and I think it's really easy to do that. And I think a lot of different entities can get into the space of being like a divine God, to
But
you.
if you just substitute the word God for any of the names of the channel disembodied, alien entities, then all of a sudden it gains a different perspective for you, right? Because what he's kind of just doing that here, right? Through my mystical union, these are self-evident. Okay, how is that different than, Xandar from, the 13th, subspace dimension? I mean, you wrap any words around this and all of a sudden it's different, right? Oh, by the way, he also says that the true authority guy is the one that's esoteric in today's society, right? He's like the Illuminati. He doesn't really advertise his own authority. He's just quietly in the background,
Manipulating everything.
exercising his authority. Which,
Yeah, that's sketchy,
well,
Yeah.
I mean,
right?
so I'm just want to
No,
point that out. It's not the guy that's like loudly proclaiming his emperorship that you worry about, right? Like Trump, but
Yeah.
it's the guy that you don't see, which is the Western paranoia here at work.
And it works about both of them.
Yeah,
there's also a sense of authority, even just authority in your own. He even talks about this authority in your own field of inquiry.
Yeah.
So you deal with facts within your purview, but ignore anything that doesn't fall on your purview. So they're actually, and he gets into the simplicity of it, actually, like the simplicity of that. It's all, he's making this grand thing, but it's really just like everything's always happening all at once anyway. It's always, we all have our authority. We all are under some authority of some kind. Some maybe the laws of physics, you could say, or something, but whether we know it or not, unconscious or not, but it's there. I don't know, and we can like fight it and suffer, or we can roll with it and not, or we can do whatever we want with it because we're free. It's like, I don't know. To me, it seems like it's like authority. Again, it's above, as above, so below. It's always happening. It always, we're always in it. So in some ways, like the book is pointless because we're already living it.
Yeah. It's
living this reality.
According to this text right here, especially in this chapter, right? Miracles can occur that will go against natural laws too, right? If you just align yourself with the divine, then you can perform miracles, which is the central Christian story, right? He is from divine authority. He is acting in a way that transcends your understanding in your void, right? Where you're seeing things wrong, your mistakes, and what you perceive as a miracle actually is just a misunderstanding of how things actually work. And so even physical laws are not true authorities because those things don't actually even belong to the realm of discussion. In fact, those things could be your own thought mistakes or your own misbeliefs, right? Because you're not in alignment with the divine. It's so easy to argue like this. And that's why it's so attractive for so many people to argue like this, because it removes uncertainty. And this is when things generally go very, very wrong for people, is that they are so certain that they are right, that bad things happen in the name of something that is really quite transcendent, or could be quite transcendent. It's
I mean,
dangerous stream of thought, stream of argument.
But he sorry, Haley, but I just wanted to say he kind of like brings that up in the very first chapter of dogmatism, when he talks about the trap of dogmatism.
But in this chapter he's dogmatic. Well, if it proves out, right, he's kind of playing fast and loose under the guise of being technical. So there's riffing there too. So he's not entirely bound by his own rules in argument.
And at some point you have to present your idea.
Yeah.
I
agree with that.
You can't just say like, well, here's my idea, but like also like, let's not be dogmatic about it. Excuse me. Oh yeah. You know what I mean? It's like at some point you just got to be like, this is what I think.
Yeah.
And you agree, you disagree, it's fine. You know what I mean? And that's like the whole thing is like, you're just talking about making counter examples. It's like, okay, great, you made a counter example. Follow that path.
Yep.
You know what I mean? See what happens. You know what I mean? And I think that's a beautiful thing. I mean, you had a reaction to it and then you moved in a direction. I think that's the whole, talking about currents and flows from Haley. That's the whole entire point. At least I think so. That's my personal opinion.
Agree. Yeah, I feel, I mean, just, overarchingly, I don't like to have my spiritual path be like sanitized, or like have it be like a purification of everything that makes me human. I do like enjoy the mistakes, and I enjoy like learning about how I can improve and kind of going through the mud of it. And I feel like that's a really integral part of the human experience that is often overlooked by such like Christian dogmatic, hermetic ways. Like it can be just a purification process that eliminates the human kind of side of things. Like that's just my overall impression from these 4 chapters so far.
But again, it's the crucifixion. Like that's part of existence, is being living, and that's part of freedom, is living our experience. So I don't think it's making an argument against that at all.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm just reading it that way. I need to be less biased on that.
Although that brings up an interesting point, right? Jesus, then did he through his free will gave away his or gain the authority by truly aligning to God's will, right? And if he is the prototype by which we're supposed to all follow, or any Christian is supposed to follow, right? Then so basically, are we then expected to live up to that standard?
Yeah. I mean, isn't that's like Christianity, right?
No, not depending on which Christianity you're talking about.
Not in practice.
Yeah,
Okay.
depending on which Christianity.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's in fact most Christianity you find out there that you would get into big trouble if you actually believe that.
Absolutely. But that's also true of like many other religions.
Yeah.
Like there's a difference between like sort of the societal manifestation of the religion
Agreed.
and the core like principle on which it spawned, right? Like the truth is that yes, if you're going to take the Christian path seriously, your spiritual ideal that you're moving towards is Christ. In the same way that if you take Buddhism seriously, your spiritual ideal would be
Buddha.
What the Buddha accomplished.
Yeah. You're finding the Buddha in yourself, right? Finding Christ
finding
in
the
yourself.
Christ in yourself,
Yeah.
which is the whole point.
Apparently there is no difference between you and Christ.
Yes.
You are literally Christ.
Because
you
Christ,
could be.
Christ is not a person.
Yeah. Christ
There's
is
no person Christ.
Yeah, Christ is Messiah.
Jesus was a person, supposedly, maybe, who the fuck knows. But Christ is the larger entity or being or force, however you would like to see that, in the same way that Siddhartha is a man, but Buddha was entirely something different.
Yeah.
It's to the symbolic meanings of things, which are tend to be subjective.
Exactly.
Very much so.
And I think that's the whole thing, is like that's what I was talking about when I was talking about paths, is like there is a raised question about, and like different religions have talked about this in different ways, but like there is a raised question about like, okay, if you create all these other paths, to where do those paths eventually lead? Do they lead to actually different places? Or were the Sikhs right when they said that all paths lead back to the one? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, because I'm a limited, fallible human being, but it's an interesting question in the context of the kinds of things that you were talking about, George.
Yeah.
Because even if you make the counter example, or you say, well, actually, I'm opposite to what you think, if you follow that path with dedication, like the monk who had truly dedicated himself to hate, would you inevitably find yourself in the same position anyway? I don't know.
Possibly. Yeah, but anything is possible.
But anything is possible.
Exactly.
And that's kind of
a point too, right? Because you need the freedom to explore. But what he is saying, that there is a right conclusion.
Right.
So let's not mince words here. He is suggesting that there is a right solution.
And the right conclusion would be to emulate a Christ-like person.
Or at the very least have compassion, right? Working compassion as an overall goal. Really that sense of love. This is what makes this particular worldview unique, right? The compassion, love is central, unlike Buddhism, where that would be rejected because it's an attachment. At least if we want to talk about what we generally consider as love. But this is a standout feature of this stream, this development over several thousand years now. So
Okay, thanks for that clarity.
there's a smell to it. There's a flavor. It's strawberry instead of banana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're both delicious.
Cool.
I prefer the avocado myself.
Avocado flavor?
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, we're just talking about fruits. I was for some ice cream. I don't know why.
They do make avocado ice creams now.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
know how I
delicious.
feel about that one.
Yeah, he seems to transition like roughly halfway or 2/3 of the way through the chapter from talking about like this emperor figure as a figure of authority that like rules to the emperor as a point of synthesis in a personal journey, and as a point of development in a personal journey. And the two things don't really, at least in my head, they're not really like fitting in with each other in a way that is clear. He seems to start off talking about the emperor as one thing and then turns it into something else. It's kind of completely different by the end of the chapter. But maybe that's just I didn't read it all the way to the end. I missed like 4 pages. But
What's the
Where is that quote?
how so does he
well,
make
like,
that transition?
he's talking about the emperor figure as like this individual that guards this coast and has renounced actual power in order to like hold this post of authority. And then like he's talking about how like the whole like political thing and how the proletariat doesn't believe in hierarchies and how the lack of an emperor is ruining the world, blah blah blah. And then over the course of a while later, he kind of just goes into more like, there's the page. He starts to talk about the Yore Vadhe and the formula, the verum sine medancio certum et verisimum, which is like on 88. He kind of goes off in this totally different direction and starts talking about how like it's the fourth station of this journey from the four senses.
Right.
Maybe I'm just not understanding it right, but it seems like he kind of switches gears halfway through the chapter and goes from talking about it in like this kind of more authoritarian way into like more of like a formula of enlightenment. But maybe that's just misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? If he's linking emperorship with authority, perhaps we don't understand what he means by authority, because he's certainly not talking about power. He's talking about.
He specifies that the authority of the emperor has nothing to do with power. He's renounced it in order to have that authority.
Yeah, it's like not something you have to enforce. So, like in terms of authority, does that then transition more naturally into that, right? As an organizing force, as a principle that event that makes things happen without you having to force things to happen. Maybe that is more of the current that he is writing on going into the later part of that discussion. I'm not quite sure because I don't remember where that was. He's talking about Superman, right? I'm sure towards the end of the chapter, he brings that up again.
Maybe he circles back and I just didn't get to that part because I'm missing the last two pages.
Yeah.
That might be what happened. Has anyone made it to the end of the chapter? I mean, I know Cody did because you're already on to the next one.
Yeah, I did, but just from you mentioning these things, I must, not been paying a lot of attention because I can't find the pages.
I'm
It's just-
hesitant
well,
to
it's
speak
kind of
because
like
my
a
brain
shift
is
in
totally.
focus that, 'cause I guess, excuse me, because I didn't get to the part where maybe he ties it all back together.
I mean, I have a quote, I think, to where he's like changing direction there. He's talking about the Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, that which is absolutely subjective, pure mystical experience must objectivize itself in consciousness and be accepted there as true Gnostic revelation, then proved to be certain by its objective fruits, sacred magic, and lastly, proved to be absolutely true in the light of pure thought based on pure subjective and objective experience, Hermetic philosophy. And it's the emperor who is the last part, the absolutely true in light of pure thought based on pure subjective and objective experience. Because the emperor is the last ha of the Yod-Heh or Yod-Heh Vod-Heh, whatever.
He's not the second? I thought he was the second.
He's
Yeah, he's the fourth one. Because the
he's the
second
fourth.
one is the first four cards are the four letters.
Gotcha.
So that there's the fourth.
But they're all contained within each other, I think, in a weird way. So it can get a little bit confusing when you think about everything containing everything. And it is like I feel like he is coming from like a bit of a holographic kind of universe.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot to me like the Ken Wilber's spiral, like dynamic kind of stuff, right? They're kind of like spiraling into each other and then circling back around, but this time in an ever widening spiral kind of idea.
Like he says at one point, the emperor signifies the authority of initiation or of the initiative.
Yeah. Literally the process of
Philosophical basically.
Yeah, the process of understanding the divine authority.
Yeah, and verifying that after going through one round, then you start all over again, right? For more and more authority is your process of discovery. And I guess he calls that later on the practical hermeticism, right? Or alchemy, as he defines it.
But in that sense of like verifying it, like creating, that's where like that's the dangerous part, right? That we're talking about. Like the prove absolutely true in the light of pure thought based on pure subjective and objective experience. Like who's to say what's pure, you know? That's what he's trying to say, is that this is like this pure perennial like universal religious experience. But
he seems to
that's a slippery slope, as we've discussed.
Yeah. He seems to be implying that if you walk this path you will reach it organically, but then anytime someone claims to be in that position of authority, like how do you verify that they've actually gotten that or that they've earned that title in any sort of way? Because all kinds of people are going to say that they have. Like,
and this author portends to have it. So
I will posit something, right? You do it, you recognize their authority by your resonance with them, because the same can be said with our relationship based on this model that he's positing. Our relationship with God is supposed to be a willing like you're willingly subjecting yourself or surrendering a part of your ego or your will to the overall will. So therefore, if I'm talking to someone and I'm looking to recognize authority, then it would be from the verification process, right? I would feel a sense of resonance with this other person based on a similar way of looking at the world, because they've come to a similar conclusion. But so I'm not implying that that's the end point. I'm just implying that somewhere along the way, you're going to be agreeing with somebody who seems to have some kind of authority, because you guys are kind of spiraling in some kind of parallel spiraling path, or you come to some similar conclusion. And this, if you extrapolate it all the way up, then you came to this conclusion based on your own free will and verification to freely unite your will with God. Or else, why would you ever unite your will with God? I mean, why would you? Unless you have just set out to be the point. That's your whole practice. I just made a decision I'm going to do that. I certainly wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing the construction of belief, right? Just
Yeah,
like,
totally.
yeah,
Right.
that's
So it's not the belief, not in the way that we understand it, right? But belief in a way where we completely do not question it. So there's a two different point. There's the belief in which you are making up your mind. This is the way I'm going to do it. This is the conclusion. Versus I've through so much experience, there's no longer any doubt. Belief is no longer belief as the way we generally define it in the popular culture. It is a non-concept at that point because there's nothing to believe. It is literally complete alignment with what you think, what you say. At that point, there is no division. You are in that current, right? So that's
true to you.
yeah.
that's the difference between being like the belief in a power that's not the divine power and belief in the just the divine, right? That's the difference.
Yeah.
That's how he's describing the alignment with the divine authority.
Yeah. So perhaps, right, this whole exercise here in the first 4 chapters is really outlining a practice. So it's another thing that I will posit here, which is describing a spiral path to discovery, and maybe not in like an endpoint kind of goal, but if you just walk this path and you keep walking it, then potentially you're going to make some discovery. So really the first 4 cards is, and this is true in normal tarot as well, if you're studying it, is that it is actually prescribing at the same time a way of practice, right? That's because magic itself tells you to practice in this way. You should gain some experience. You should like discover some stuff by being in union. You should go into gnosis a lot and experiment, right? And then you should confirm all the stuff. And then if it makes sense, then, yeah, great. If it doesn't, then dump it, right? To try something different and then try the whole process again.
Yeah. And that part makes sense to me.
I like that. I see that for sure. And in partnership, these first 4 cards do a lot. Yeah, you could do a lot with them. Or like that's a good journey.
Yeah. So it's fun. It's fun for me to read this because it's very circuitous. Like it takes a very circular path, which is the way I think. So I enjoy it.
Well, cool. I don't know. Is this any more topics?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm very satisfied with our discussion with power.
I'm not very satisfied with his explanation of power.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it will take a few more cards for it to all kind of.
What is your what are all of your definitions of power? I mean, did we already say that? I mean, I said mine, but
you kind of you talked about power. What would you use power for? I guess it's the pointed question I will ask you. What is the purpose of power for you?
Self-development, probably. I don't know, living? Isn't that like, don't you use? That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think it's natural to use forms of power and just in different parts of your life every day. Understanding how to use that power and how you can channel it. I like to do that for magic, magical self-development purposes, or,
So against the prescription of this chapter, right? Self-development should not be your goal, is what he says, literally.
Yeah, because it just makes
yeah, because your will is in it, right?
Materialistic idol if you're trying to
okay, so I'm in there. It's me.
So this is a fun discussion. I'm having a great time because there's so much material in here that you can just I just take a play from his own playbook, which is just to take it out of context and quote him and just use it in nefarious ways, because that's how he's using it, really. But without the nefarious intention, but it ends up being nefarious coming off the page anyway. Yeah. So for me, right, the definition of power is shifting always, right? As I grow, my definition of power changes. Right now, my idealistic version of power is the cessation of worrying about it altogether. So it's the negative definition of power. It's literally being able to go through your day with less concern about power. But really, when you're talking about power and you're focusing on power, it implies a lack to do the kind of things that you want to do. So for me, power is very much about accomplishing the stuff that you need to do. And it requires something extra or something that you don't currently perceive or have. And so therefore, like currently, my practice is really about to decrease my need for power or even concern for power at all. Is to literally become more effective in my day-to-day. So I don't think about power as much as I used to. So
that because you were hyper focused on it before?
Yeah, because it's about, hey, I'm going to gain more power to power through, right? I'm going to put more voltage to make that thing turn faster, right? I'm going to depress the pedal on that Tesla so it will go faster in the electric motor because it's dishing more power more electricity to the motor, right? That's generally how power is understood, the ability to do work, right?
Yeah.
You take force and you make it do work, and that's the potential to do work is power. So
yeah, it's like putting yourself in a flow state that is in sync with everything else so that you don't have to power anything.
yeah.
You're being carried along by the current of everything else.
Yeah, I'm sure you have like so much firsthand experience with that in the flow state of creation, right? Like creating things out of your mind, out of the flow in the current.
I try. There's good days and bad days.
You always have the power to curse. That's good. I'm setting this on fire.
And I like his definitions in the early chapters of like effort what is it, like concentration without effort bringing joy and not toil, so like it is that flow again, flow states. Yeah, I think you're right, Leo. For me, I agree with that definition, that flow state. And I think I agree with you too, George. I think that flow state is kind of difficult when you're worried about having more power,
Yeah.
Or there's a way of like, it's like what he says about that kind of concentration that's like the fiery, like get it done. That's like that's all ultimately destructive in his view, and in my view too, that kind of power, or just power that you're just in it, like that's just it's like trusting the universe that it just will give you what you need to have joy.
Yeah. It's like the difference between trying to do things entirely into your own steam and tapping into a much larger power source than you individually have. And like one of them is going to be this kind of eternal struggle of like an uphill battle, and the other one is effortless. But you probably need a little bit of one to get the other one going.
Yeah.
Just passively surrendering to everything is going to just leave you sitting there. Like, I don't think you reach a flow state by just sitting there. Like, you usually have to start struggling. And then once you reach a certain point, you hit this place where it suddenly becomes effortless. And you don't feel like you're driving at that point. Like, your intention is still driving the direction you're going, but you don't feel like you're pushing, you're the one pushing it.
So recently I've started doing the Donnie Darko practice, what I call the Donnie Darko practice, which is always be looking about 5 seconds ahead. You guys all seen Donnie Darko, right?
Yeah.
Like, remember, like he's like, walking around and he sees this thing that goes out in front of him, and that he's basically just following that thing. Like he sees like out of time, so he's essentially like following this line and then walking and doing all the stuff. You can actually kind of see what's going to happen in the future. And I'm actually starting to actually use that as a kind of practice, right? To remind myself to be carried instead of try to muscle through everything, that to power through everything. And just kind of like watch myself being carried along as if I'm watching the movie, watching him being carried around. Like he in the movie actually is observing himself, like, in that way. So I find that to to be a kind of a fun thing to play around with. So recently I've been started to do that a little bit. So maybe you guys can, if you feel inspired, do something like that. So that it's really not of your doing at all. You're just kind of like seeing what you're doing, and then you're just kind of like being carried along and doing that thing. So you're not really doing anything. You're just kind of like, things are just happening and you're kind of watching the movie of your life. I kind of like that. Movies are a great source of magical practices, if I have to say so myself. I often see things, and like years later, I'm like, hey, I'm going to actually turn that into a practice. I'm going to turn that into part of my magical procedure. And they're generally always fun, often unpredictable, and always a good time, a frolicking good time, as I say.
Mhm. I think energy should flow. So I will analyze how I'm using power in my practice a little bit more, because it's interesting. I think I'm pretty in line actually, but I might be forcing a little bit. Conclusion on that topic.
I think we're all forcing, not a little bit, a lot. So
Yeah. Usually I feel like I'm forcing myself more than other things. So
yeah.
because I'm always the biggest obstacle. So most of my beating my head against the wall is beating anything.
So you're expanding a great deal of energy to try to get the inertia going. Hey, you're Earth, so there you go.
Yep.
That's generally our challenge. Once it gets going, it's kind of hard to stop it. Like we won't quit
Yeah, we
working.
have a hell of a lot of momentum once we
Yeah,
get
once it gets moving, but to get it moving, man.
Yeah, I sympathize.
Yeah.
Mine is different in that I've flit around from thing to thing. I never stop, but I never go deep on anything. Kind of.
I think that's me too, honestly. Like
Yeah.
I don't, but that's why I notice like when I'm in the space that I'm really interested in, I'll gain a lot of power super quickly. Like I'll be I was like 2 years at college and I was like elected for like positions in both times, just because I always showed up to meetings. They're like, you just want to be in it? I'm like, yeah, and then like blasphemous articles written about me because I was just like inserted my way into these things, but then as soon as I was over it, it just like dissolved immediately,
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Just where I'm at now and understanding that a little bit more, and like where my
That's a
framework is
superpower.
around that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you need to recognize your superpower. That's actually a superpower.
Okay, what is?
What you just described.
Okay.
Yeah.
showing up
Yeah,
consistently.
that's literally generating power generator. You are the the hydroelectric station, and you know how to do that. So you can actually apply that to accomplish a lot very quickly. As long as you can motivate yourself intensely in that way, you actually have a superpower. You just described it.
Cool.
Yeah.
It feels like that. Yeah. It's
Yeah. Mine is once I get started, I can't stop. So
Mhm.
the immovable objects, I don't care. They're going to be moved. So, and I'm like, I'll just steamroll like everything in my path. It doesn't matter the amount of time, but I can't stop. That's my problem.
Yeah.
I have to literally distract myself to stop.
Mhm.
Yeah, my momentum manifests that once there's a deadline in place and a thing needs to happen by this time, I won't
Yeah.
stop until it's done.
Yeah, I won't stop.
I get progressively more efficient. The closer I get to the farther from the finish line, the less efficient and harder to get in my way. That's why deadlines are good for me.
I'm right there with you. Yeah, but Cody, I'm at times in different areas, different focus points. I'm more like you, where it's just kind of like this lights up, this lights up. They don't seem to be related in any way, and then like something else in like a z axis lights up, and but that doesn't generally happen in my kind of work. workish life. It happens in like my own personal interest type of stuff. I'm unfocused. Just in different areas, just different distributions. So I have a lot of air, I have a lot of earth, yeah, for sure.
I'm air over water, man. Prince of Cups. Prince of Cups.
Yeah, I think we call that a hurricane. Add some heat to
Probably
that.
some kind of superpower in that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you know,
Nice.
awesome. This book is awesome. I'm really enjoying it, and it's really selling a lot of these ideas that I've just been too ignorant or too resistant to look deeply into. And I think it's actually it's good for my magical practice to really get deeper into many of these truly ideas that are thousands of years in the making, and there's a real tradition behind it, and they're deeply thought out. And so while I disagree with a lot, it doesn't really matter what I think. I think it's healthy sometimes just to get into somebody else's viewpoint and really be there for an extended amount of time, because I am learning a ton. I'm really enjoying this book. So just want to
Same.
put that out there.
Yeah.
Don't take my criticism as my hating on this book, because it's completely the opposite. If I really hated it, I don't think I would have said anything. I just kind of hang out in the background, scowling.
No, I mean, it's really interesting to hear all the criticisms and to hear all the different colliding viewpoints.
Yeah.
I don't know, didn't really feel that I had much fruitful to say in this discussion this time around. And I feel like actually Cody glanced at a lot of things that I had thought in a concise enough way. So yeah.
Yeah. We're having really good discussions. So that's wonderful.
Last kind of funny point. Do we think the communists dethroned God? I know
No.
you mentioned that.
We kind of dethroned them too, right? So-
Okay, good answer.
I think the Christians dethroned God more than
Yeah.
I think I'll pull a Cody and say that he is
The
being
proletariat.
dethroned and throned at the same time at all times. At all points in time.
There we go. Fun stuff. Okay, so 2 weeks for the Pope. I will try to finish this
Yep.
chapter this time.
Heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy stuff. Good night. See
Is the
some
Pope-
of you. What was that?
The Pope is the Hierophant, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
Okay.
analogous, right?
yeah, analogous.
Good to know. Oh, I'm going to stop recording.